Nazis believed in the purity of the German race and saw Jewish people, black people, homosexuals, Romani people, Polish people, Soviet soldiers, Jehovah's Witnesses as the ultimate threat, as well as people with disabilities, and that's not to mention anyone who tried to stand against the Nazis and not fall in line. And plans were underway to wipe their enemies from the face of the earth. It was basically a racial cleansing, which was often achieved by imprisonment, sterilization, castration, and murder. But it did not end there. Between 1942 and 1945, a series of horrific human experiments were carried out on prisoners of Nazi Germany who were being kept at Auschwitz and other camps. These experiments could also be called torture because that's exactly what they were. These experiments were carried out in order to help the German military who may get injured in the field. The prisoners would go through extensive experiments that were intended to replicate some of the difficulties a soldier would encounter in combat, and these experiments were cruel and somewhat sadistic. Now, first of all, we're going to talk about the high altitude experiments that replicated how it would feel for a pilot to abandon his plane at 68,000 feet. Basically, the doctors would take notes as the prisoners were forced into this low pressurized tank and they would slowly suffocate as the doctors took notes of the victims' last moments before they lost consciousness or just died. This included a 37-year-old that was documented in a letter. Apparently, the 37-year-old was in good health upon going into the tank, and notes were taken as the man began to suffocate. After 4 minutes, apparently his head started to wiggle on his shoulders. A minute later, he started to feel painful cramps before falling to the floor unconscious. After this, his breathing reduced to 3 times per minute, and after half an hour of no oxygen, the man died, turned blue, and foamed at the mouth. An hour later, the body was subjected to an autopsy. Out of the 200 victims, 80 died outright, whilst the rest were just simply murdered. They were executed if they were no longer necessary. But of course, this wasn't the only experiment that was taking place. We also had the freezing experiments, and these were carried out to treat German soldiers who would suffer from hypothermia in the field, fighting in very cold temperatures. The prisoners were placed in a basin of freezing cold water filled with ice for up to 3 hours. On one occasion, 2 Russian officers who had been taken prisoner were placed in the basin naked, and they managed to stay conscious for up to 2 hours. After that, the pain became too much to bear, and one of the soldiers asked for mercy and to be shot. But no mercy of any form would be given, and the other Russian prisoner actually turned to his friend and said, "Don't expect any mercy off these people, you're not going to get it." And so the Russian prisoners just simply shook hands and accepted their fate. A little later, they died, and the bodies were sent away for autopsies. Other prisoners were stripped naked and forced to stand out in the open air temperatures of below 6, and eventually the pain became too much to bear, and they would begin to scream in agony as their limbs froze. After the freezing experiments, if some of the prisoners were lucky enough to have actually survived, they would be reheated, not out of kindness. Remember, this was all part of the research. The Nazi doctors didn't care at all about these people. One of the ways they reheated the victims was by simply placing them in a hot bath. But there were other ways, other methods that they used to reheat these victims that were a little bit strange. Sometimes women were brought in from the concentration camp brothels. These women were known as concentration camp prostitutes. These women had either volunteered to be in these brothels after being promised an early release and an easier life within the camp, or they were simply forced into the brothels. These women were often brought in to lie with the freezing prisoners to provide body heat, and it was recorded how fast the reheating process took. On some occasions, the women were forced to have sex with the prisoners, which showed positive results when it came to the warming of the frozen men. It is said that around 300 prisoners were used in these freezing experiments, sometimes not just once but over and over again, and they suspect that maybe 100 people died due to this experiment alone. On another occasion, a priest was placed into the basin of ice water. He had been dressed in an aviation suit, and wires were attached to his back and to his rectum to measure his temperature. The man asked to be taken out of the water after a few hours, only to be laughed at by those running the experiment. After about an hour and a half, the temperature of the freezing water was actually lowered, and a blood sample was taken from the priest's ear. He was given a shot of schnapps and cigarettes, and later some lukewarm grog, whilst he was still in the water, may I add. After a while, his limbs became rigid and he broke out in a cold sweat. And it was not long before the priest lost consciousness. When he regained consciousness, he was laid down on a stretcher, being warmed up by lamps and blankets. But once again, may I remind you, this was not out of kindness. For on the very same day, he was taken directly to the malaria station, where he was told to keep what happened to him a secret or suffer the consequences. In the malaria station, he was introduced to more horrendous experiments. This time, he would be infected with malaria and studied. Now, this man was actually one of the survivors, and that's why we have his personal story. He said that whilst he was being treated for the malaria that they had infected him with, they were testing all these kinds of different drugs, and some of the drugs were basically making him feel like he was losing his mind. And at times, he actually forgot how to speak. But upon regaining his sanity as the drugs wore off, he then refused to have any more injections because they made him so ill and made him feel so bad. And the priest knew that he was taking a chance by refusing the treatment, because to refuse would often mean death, would mean execution. But he'd gone through so much, he just refused point blank that he was not having the injection, only to be told by the doctor that he was not in charge of his own life. The doctor was in charge of his life. And in the end, the priest thought it was best to comply instead of facing the deadly consequences, and he accepted the injections. The prisoners that were used in the malaria tests were forced to place their hands into a cage of infected mosquitoes that would then bite the prisoners and infect them, or they were simply injected with infected blood, which the doctors always had in their possession. You see, they would make sure that they took blood from the infected prisoners quite often, and they stored it to infect more prisoners with. The infected prisoners were then treated with drugs to fight the disease. Some doses were too high, and many of the prisoners died. And the ones that survived lived their lives with some disabilities due to the infection and then the treatment. But the priest was one of the lucky ones, if you can actually call him that. He was actually liberated and he made it out alive, although after all those horrific experiments, he said that he was never the same again. He had a weak heart and he could no longer walk at a fast pace, and he sweated quite a lot. In 1944, experiments into making seawater drinkable was underway to help the German Air Force and the Navy in the event of a plane crashing into the sea or a ship sinking, meaning that the men would have to survive by making seawater safe to drink if they were stranded for long periods of time. During the experiments, the prisoners were sorted into 4 groups. The first group received no water and no food. The second group drank plain seawater and received the following shipwreck diet of 1 ounce of biscuits, sweet condensed milk, butter and chocolate. The third group drank seawater that had been processed to conceal the taste, but the saline still remained. They received the following shipwreck diet of 1 ounce of biscuits, sweet condensed milk, butter and chocolate. And the fourth group were given water treated to remove the salt, and they received the following shipwreck diet of 1 ounce of biscuits, sweet condensed milk, butter and chocolate. It is said that most of the prisoners actually volunteered for this experiment. You see, they were promised more rations and an easier workload if they complied, but none of these perks were ever granted. And if they refused to drink the water or do as they were told, they were threatened with death, or a tube was force-fed down their throat, and the seawater was pumped down the tube into their stomachs. These prisoners became so dehydrated that they resorted to licking freshly mopped floors to get just a little bit of water, as well as trying to suck water out of rags used to clean up spilled water. The victims that survived claimed that they felt they were losing their minds from thirst. They became raving mad and foamed at the mouth, yet no pity was ever offered. And once the prisoners reached this level of dehydration, the doctors would then perform liver punctures, and they would do this by sticking a hypodermic needle into the side of the prisoners, straight into the liver. Now, like I said at the beginning of the episode, the Nazis were big into this racial cleansing. The Nazi government made it compulsory for a mass sterilisation program to go ahead. That would sterilise anyone that did not fit the criteria, which was, in a nutshell, a lot of innocent people who were genetically diseased, innocent people with disabilities, deafness, schizophrenia, epilepsy, feeble-mindedness, blindness, alcoholism, and of course, just being Jews. And even though this program was well underway in Germany, the medical researchers still wanted to find new ways to sterilise people more efficiently and quicker, and with as little effort as possible. So, of course, more experiments went underway, and the chosen prisoners were put through more tests. The women had certain chemicals injected into their ovaries, and they had no pain relief. Another way to sterilise the victims was to expose the men's genitalia and the women's abdomens to radiation. This was fast and it was cheap. Some were executed afterwards due to serious X-ray burns that made them incapable of working, and they simply became useless to the Nazis, and they were literally put down like a dog. And of course, all of this was done secretly, with not even one victim being aware that they were being sterilised. Some of the women were also raped, so the doctors could follow the path the sperm took inside the woman's reproductive organs. Other horrific experiments were well on the way to test the effectiveness of the sulfonamide drug on soldiers who had been exposed to gas gangrene. And to do this, they took unwilling prisoners and inflicted wounds upon their bodies. And then they would tie off the blood vessels to these wounds to simulate a real injury on the battlefield. After this, they would purposely infect the wounds with bacteria, and to help speed up the process, they would pack the wound with wood shavings and ground glass, and then the victim would be treated with the drug. And of course, many died during the experiments. Also, there was bone muscle and nerve regeneration experiments and bone transplantation experiments. In these experiments, the prisoners would have their thighs cut into and the muscle removed. Then the wound would be closed up. After only a week, the wound would then be reopened and more muscle was taken. And in other cases, bones were removed, or they were simply broken or shattered. These were done on not only men but women prisoners, and their muscles were also removed. The prisoners would also have their entire limbs removed. This was of course a transplantation experiments where entire limbs were taken from one poor soul and attached to another, who would also have their limb removed, just so that they could attach this other limb that they had taken from the other victim. And on many occasions, if the victim survived the removal of a limb, they were simply killed. And the ones that were being observed would receive no sedatives to ease the pain. In the book Doctors from Hell, it was said that around 10 feeble-minded prisoners, a term that is no longer used, were taken to be experimented on because they were seen as expendable. But I suppose you could say that about all the prisoners that were experimented on. As far as these Nazis were concerned, they were all expendable. Life meant nothing to them, especially the lives of these prisoners. One woman had her entire arm removed, including the shoulder blade, which made it impossible to raise her good arm. And on other occasions, bones would actually be broken with hammers, and bones removed and placed inside the actual muscle of the same victim. And then studies were then done on that. Sometimes it seems like these doctors weren't purely doing things for medical research. Although this was their own twisted medical research that they were performing, sometimes to me it seems like they were just doing it to be cruel, to be sadistic, to be evil. It seems like they got a kick out of it, in my opinion. Experiments were also done on homosexual men. These experiments went ahead by inserting a capsule under the skin of homosexual men, which released testosterone in hopes of making them heterosexual. This, of course, was a failure. Even though some of the homosexual men reported that the capsule had worked and that they were now heterosexual, this was, of course, the men claiming this out of fear, hoping that they would be released. And, of course, this never happened. And, of course, quite a lot of men died during the process. Another method that was used was castration. And this was a commonly used method. And by doing this, the Nazis believed that the homosexuality could not be spread by intercourse. This was, of course, the belief at the time, the ignorant belief at the time. There were also experiments underway to understand the length of time it took a person to die from certain poisoning. On one occasion, certain poisons were given to 4 Russian prisoners in their food, unknown to them, whilst the 4 German doctors stood behind curtains observing their experiments. The 4 Russian prisoners actually survived the poisoning, only to be strangled to death on hooks in a crematorium. Autopsies were then carried out on the dead bodies to understand the effects that the poison had had upon the men when they had ingested the poison. Later, new ways of poisoning these innocent prisoners was introduced, which involved being shot by a poison bullet and having poison injected directly into the skin, which then formed big black liquid-filled boils on the bodies, which were extremely painful. And then there were the mustard gas experiments. In these experiments, the prisoners were wounded and then exposed to the mustard gas, which formed nasty chemical burns upon their skin and even caused blindness and extreme pain. On some occasions, prisoners were then injected with the gas or forced to breathe it in. The prisoners who died were taken away for autopsy. And believe me, I'm just skimming the surface. There were so many other experiments, human experiments that were going on at the time. Experiments where they were trying to change the colour of the eye by injecting dye into children's eyeballs. And there were also experiments ran on twins where they would take two twins and try to sew them together to make conjoined twins for some bizarre reason. These Nazi doctors, these medical assistants, these scientists had no shame in what they did to these innocent people, whose only crime was to exist, to be seen as inferior, as a genetic failure, and according to the Nazis, they needed to be wiped from the earth. The Hippocratic Oath meant very little to these evil men who swore to never inflict harm and to care for people, and I think we can all agree that they failed miserably. There were 15,754 documented victims of the human experiment trials, but there were believed to be even more that went undocumented. And would you believe that the results that was found from these human experiments, which saw many people tortured to death, has actually lent a hand in modern day research? You see, a lot of the findings from the human experiment research that was carried out by the Nazis is actually helped to advance medical treatment to this day. And some people frown upon that. They say that these results should not be used because it was unethical the way these results were found. But in my opinion, it's a bit of a grey area. But as long as those results are now being used for good, to prevent people from getting ill, to prevent people from dying, then, I think maybe something should be done with them to turn it into something good. To salvage something out of these results that cause so much pain and devastation and make it good. I don't think that's such a bad thing. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you very, very soon. Bye guys, take care.